So we have 2 hours. So how do we plan it? I speak for 1 hour and leave 1 hour for discussion. Will that be?
Something like that.
Something like that. Okay. Now I planned this discussion on the post-colonial subject. I planned it in 2 parts. One deals with or will deal with some of the experiences and some of the issues that cropped up in the wake of the emergence of the anti-colonial and the post-colonial political subject. And the other, I do not know whether that will interest you, but if it interests you, do tell me. In view of the debates in Marxism on the whole question of subject and subjectivity, how does this whole post-colonial configuration of the political subject look like? But the second part is, of course, deals with much more theoretical issues and I wouldn't say doctrinaire issues, but certainly if you are not interested in that part, I want to leave that out. I do not want to impose that discussion on you. So I will take the better part of the 1 hour on the main thing, but it leads to the second part. But do tell me if that interests you, otherwise I shall leave that out. Now the main point that I want to make here is that if one looks into the political activities of the anti-colonial people, and obviously India is a big experience for me, but to the extent that one has studied other kinds of writings, and I'm not saying the usual academic post-colonial writings, but I'm thinking of, let us say, Frantz Fanon or Mao, who were not scholars, but who were political thinkers, activists, leaders in their own right. Something that strikes immediately as one reads these writings is that the thinking about the political subject is delinked from the question of the self. In general, in Western political theory, you would find the discussion on the subject and subjectivity with the question of self. But generally, in the anti-colonial writings, from which the post-colonial arguments of this subject draw a lot, the question of the self was not important. The theory of the subject, therefore, emanates much more directly from a range of political practices rather than from any given philosophical discourse. Now, there is a reason for that, which we would not have the time here to go into details, but safe to say, point out that the advent of the colonial rule meant also an interruption in the way in which philosophical thinking went on in countries like India. Generally, in thinking of, let us say, the self in India, but there are other countries and one can go into other kinds of writings. But with the Indian example, all one can say is that we have 2 great instances of philosophical writings on politics, not much. One is, of course, the famous Kautilya's Arthashastra, which is an advice to the king, written much before Machiavelli wrote his Prince, on how to run the kingdom, how to run the princedom. And it is called Arthashastra, which means, Artho means economy. So, how to run the kingdom, how to take care of the spies, how to keep things secret, how to manage your finances, etc., and how the household and the kingdom, how they can combine well in running the society. It's not any discourse on how to manage life properly, but it's simply an advice on how to run the kingdom. And exactly almost at the time when the British came and conquered India, around 1770s, this is a long tradition, but I'm just giving you the beginning and the end of this tradition, where there is a famous, again, a Persian writing called Siyarul Mutakharin, where the writer writes in detail how the old princes had become corrupt, how they had lost the art of managing their princedoms or their empires, and therefore the English, not the British, but the person who knew the qualities of who had more integrity, who were much more dogged in their enterprise, how they therefore rightly defeated the Indians because the Indians were not worthy of self-rule. So if the Indians have to recover their power to rule themselves, then the Indians better learn from the British. Again, these are very canonical texts, but in these writings, there is no question of how you rebuild yourself. The individual self is absent. There is also a fascinating book written by a historian of Indian philosophy. It is called The Lost Age of Reason. And it's about new thinking in the 14th, 15th, and 16th centuries, where again, if you go through that, you can see that the philosophical thinkings are rarely concerned with the question of self. The idea of self, there is a Sanskrit synonym to that, but on the whole, we can say that thinking of politics and thinking on philosophy, these were two different things. They had very little connections with them. And with this in the background, think of the British coming, which then affects an enormous rupture into the way the Indian thinking went on. And as I say, that you can link it to some of the classic writings of in the Turco-Persian world also, and then you will be able to appreciate the fact that why in the Renaissance political thinking from the 19th century onwards, the question of politics had nothing to do with self. So what were the issues that politics discussed, let's say from 1860s onwards? And there are, I will give you some instances instead of cataloging those things. You know, we had the Great Mutiny, which is called the Indian Mutiny of 1857, which is the first great anti-colonial uprising. And before that, I hope you are all conversant with the name Wahhabi, which is a very dominant strand of Islamic thinking, which began from the early, mid of the 18th century. And the Wahhabi thinking reached India. It is today considered as one of the Puritan forms of Islamic thinking. And Wahhabis, when they reached India, apparently, this is the given history, that the Wahhabis were hateful of other religions, as we today think of the Wahhabis, the Salafis, and others. It began in Egypt. It quickly spread to across the Middle East and reached India. Now, India, and I do not want again to go into the theoretical questions which will come, but I want to explain to you, tell you the real circumstances. Please understand, India in the 1850s was a time when, if you again are familiar with one more name, very well known in Jamaluddin al-Afghani, who was a Turkish thinker, who lived during the late Ottoman times, who lived part of the time in Paris. He was a Shia who went to Egypt also and who came to India because he knew that in India there was a great ferment in Islamic thinking. And when he crossed Afghanistan, because Afghanistan was a Sunni-dominated country, he had the flexibility to change his name and to take on Al-Afghani, which means of Afghanistan. of Afghanistan. So here is Jamaluddin, who is of Afghanistan, meaning that he is a Sunni, and comes over to India, which is a Sunni-dominated country, meets all the Maulavis, Dervish, and all other Muslim preachers in Hyderabad. He was given a civic reception in Calcutta, and he also carried a particular kind of Islamic thinking, which engaged with the question of colonialism, which engaged with the whole question of what should be the identity of the people who fight against alien rule. Now, there was a great debate that started even within these Islamist thinkers. Should India be considered as Darul Haram, which means it's a land of the evil, because there are Christians, there are Hindus, there are other religions besides the people who believed in Islam? Or should it be considered as Darul Harab, which means the land of the pious, which means that even though there are non-believers or believers in other religions, can the Muslims coexist with them? Now, these kinds of questions were being dealt with. I give you the example, illustrate it, to give you a sense of the debates that started occurring between what can be called, with a bit of stretching our imagination, the public intellectuals of that time. So this was kind of among the Muslim clerics. And it was during this time that the Great Mutiny happens. In the Great Mutiny, whose one of the epicenters was Delhi, which is the current capital of the country, there was this question of the kind of, how would you put it, a kind of Republican or a kind of Jacobin thinking among some of the Muslim insurgents. One of the leaders of the rebellious army section, who marched on from Meerut and other cities to Delhi, they came to Delhi, they entered the Red Fort, which was the seat of the deposed empire, and the emperor was sleeping at that time, who was the second Bahadur Shah. He was later sent to exile by the British after they suppressed the mutiny to Burma. And with his shoes on, this military leader, who was a Muslim and a believer in Wahhabis, think of the Republican idea in that there was no respect for the emperor. He straight went into the bedroom of the emperor and said, "You are a lazy ruler. Sit up. Is this the time to sleep? And you should go out on the streets. You should come out of the fort and tell the people what to do and what not to do. Now that the alien forces, the British, they are all around the city and they're going to attack us in any time." So the emperor, of course, considered it as an act of high insolence, but he couldn't do anything. And in the following 3 months, when the British could not capture the city of Delhi, there are remarkable evidences of how these rebel soldiers, how they formed a committee to govern the city and the country, how it was, one of the early incipient thinking on citizenship, how the town was to be ruled, and how appeals were made to the Hindu wealthy people that they should join the rebellion, and the fact that they had their own god and the Muslims had their own god should not deter Muslims and Hindus from joining hands and fighting the British. So the reason why I told you this, thing, it's an extremely colorful episode in our country's history, and some people, including me, we have said that the 1857 rebellious constitution of how to run Delhi is the first independent constitution of India. This is the first act of claiming citizenship. Now, the reason why I'm describing this is you can see why I am saying that the thinking of subject had very little to do with philosophical heritage in that sense. 50 years down the line, we have in Bengal, when the terrorist modern revolutionaries started, appeared on the scene, and the British officials were being murdered, modern ideals of nationalism, democracy, I'm talking of 1902 to 1905, 1906, one after another British, administrators were being shot dead by these terrorist revolutionaries. So they brought out a journal, and this journal is called in Bengali Jugantar, which means transformation of an age. And there was a column in the journal, it came out maybe 2-3 months later, it was irregularly published, but it was highly popular. It was proscribed. In those days, 3,000 to 4,000 copies of that journal were circulated. And someone who used to name himself as mad by the yardstick of the age, which Bengali is called Jugo Kappa, which means, Kappa means I am mad, I am deranged. I know I am deranged, but I am deranged according to the standards of the age. So the age thinks that the questions that I am raising is the questions that only a madman can raise. But, he doesn't say but that was the pseudonym that he had given to him. It wasn't her, it was still in those days him. So in those, monthly or bi-monthly columns, the questions that he raised became the classic questions of the political subject in the country, meaning, who are you to rule? You English, you have come to our country. Who are you to rule? What does color mean? Color of the skin. How much difference does it make? This was important because, please understand, the Mughals were also fair-skinned. They came from Central Asia. They were Mongols. They were the descendants of Taimur and Genghis Khan both. Babur came from Samarkand. And they were fair complexion. So it's not that Indians had not seen fair complexion people, but for the first time, and even though interracial marriages were not that common in the Mughal age, because there was a Turco-Persian aristocracy that ruled the society from the top. At the same time, race had not become politically, in that sense, that crucial building block for organizing the rule. Whereas in the British time, it was very clear that race is going to be, not during the early ages of the British rule when interracial marriages were very common. In fact, the founder of Calcutta married 3 sisters, Job Charnock, who founded Calcutta in 1707. He had 3 sisters and he married all of them together. And the early British period, colonial period, is full of interracial marriages. But it is only with the beginning of the Victorian age that you find the hardening of the racial lines as organizing principles of rule emerging in India. But be that as it may, by 1907, so this question was being raised, what does color of the skin mean? And then, of course, it's not I, who am I, but who are we? Why can we demand, or why should we demand self-rule? Suppose we get the right to rule ourselves. What shall we do with this right? And fascinating were the following question, why should we kill? Now, killing is bad. But if killing is bad, how do we remove the British from India? But if killing is good, do we have, in our old philosophy, justification for killing? So that is the time when the Indian epic of Mahabharata was again brought back for public discussion, because in the Mahabharata, I do not know whether you were conversant with the epic or not, but in that epic there is a big chapter on where the Lord discusses the whole question of killings of enemies with the disciple, Arjuna. And the warrior, before he enters the war, he is beset with the whole prospect of killing his brother, killing his next door neighbor, killing the friends, killing ordinary people, and with whom he had no personal enmity. Arjuna, the warrior. So the charioteer, who is the Lord himself, Lord Krishna, he asks Krishna, why is it that I am being asked to kill? What is the destiny or purpose of my life? And the Lord explains in the old way that you are not to decide what is good or bad, but you are to enact out, you are to act out, or your role, the given role in your life. So this old Mahabharata, the epic, was brought back to discussion. It was somewhat like return to, the Greek texts during the times of European thinking of modern times. But it was much more of a return to the ancient question of killing, showing mercy, the necessity of self-rule, etc., etc. But as I am saying, the question of self was relevant only to the extent that we were discussing the collective national subject. And I shall end this part with one more reference to if you read Fanon's writings closely, now you might say that Frantz Fanon, in series of writings, deals with the question of anti-colonial self. So to that extent, you might say that what I am arguing is only partially right. But if you read his writings closely, only when Fanon thinks that the individual self in the colonial land is corrupted by the vices that have been brought by the settlers. And how can you clean yourself of the vices? Fanon's answer was, to that extent, it was unbridled and unrestrained violence, in the sense that you can only by killing the enemy, and Fanon's exact words said that you have to soak your hands with the blood of the enemy so that you can purify your soul. So Fanon, typically, who was somewhat a psychiatrist who thought of, you were all conversant with his writings. So in that sense, yes, Fanon, to the extent that he spoke of anti-colonial liberation, thought of the self. And the question of self was relevant to him because he thought that in order to purify the self that has become compromised, or that is compromised with the existence of colonialism, has to be purified. But, and Fanon's background is much more directly confronting, or with his background, he much more directly confronted the question of race. So you all know the question of mask and the scheme, etc. But in a much more, as you, at least in Indian, and if you take into account Mao Zedong's writings on China and others, you can see that even in Mao's writings, to the extent you can say these are communist but also post-colonial writings, you can see that Mao is not interested in the individual peasant, recovering his self. The recovery of the self, which is a very modern sign of the post-colonial theory. Ashish Nandy has written one after another tract of that. If you read Gayatri Chakraborty's Spivak's, that famous or infamous article, Who Speaks for the Subaltern? Can the Subaltern Speak? You have this whole idea of the recovery of the subaltern self. But in the classic anti-colonial struggles, there is no question of a subaltern self that will redeem itself. There is no idea of a recovery of self. There is the idea that nation has to become independent. There is a much more materiality to the politics that was being practiced by these people. The point there through these that I am trying to make is that in general you may argue that whereas I do not want to make the two stereotypes of Western political theory and as Peter said that I am against that. So I do not want to go along that line, but to make things little more easier in terms of understanding that to the extent that we think that the idea of the subject is deeply ingrained as a philosophical problem and politics draws from it, my argument is exactly the other way around. That the question of the subject appears as a political question. And it is only then that philosophers try to generalize it or spiritualize it, speculate on the whole thing, on which I do not want to go. But to the extent that subject emerges from politics, politics is not so much a matter of discourse, but much more a matter of repertoire of actions. That is why you find in the chronicle or in the whole, the history of the emergence of political subjects, you have these debates again and again. Why should we kill? How should we kill? How should we lead our life? What kind of daily life that a revolutionary should practice? What kind of language we should write so that we can convince people of the arguments that we are making, etc., etc. So it's a much more, discussion on actions, and it's not an identity of self that is being discussed, but an identity of actions. And I think this is a major question which has been till not discussed adequately by political theorists, but which need much more discussion. So there is a displacement, therefore, of the whole issue of identity. We are moving away from the identity of self to the identity of practices. And that is why the question of violence, the question of modes of weapon, even in 1966, when there was all around the youth violence throughout the world, this country, this city had also seen its, fair amount of violence and unrest in the 60s. In India, during the Naxalite revolutionary uprising, again the question was discussed, what kind of weapons do you need? How do you, convince people of the correctness of your thinking? What kind of language should you use? It was in fact invoking almost the Mayfair movement of China, that why do you need a language? You do not need a language to give expression to yourself, but you need a language in order to make a community of believers in the cause that you think to be true. So when I say the identity of actions and not the identity of self, this is the meaning that I want to, by and large, therefore, what I am arguing is that in the repeated emergence of the political subject, you can see that there are discussions, recurrent discussions on how to practice politics, how to frame political actions. And when the question of ethics also comes, take Gandhi, one of the more well-known examples. Now in Gandhi, again, Gandhi in fact in some sense straddles both the world of ethical theory, etc., etc. In a way, you may say that Gandhi was much more westernized than many other non-Gandhian revolutionary thinkers. And Gandhi's other strand, you might say, draws from actions. Now, take Gandhi's, that famous tract, Hind Swaraj, with the British, outlawed, proscribed it, and it was called, and it's a bomb that is going to explode on the scene. Now, in Hind Swaraj, when Gandhi says that you have to be a seeker of truth, at one level, Gandhi is saying you have to purify yourself. Because Gandhi's argument is also on the whole along the terrorist revolutionary line, which is that yourself is compromised. It's also the Fanonian line, that yourself is compromised because you have coexisted with the alien ruler. So the alien rulers have taught you many things which have sullied you, which have corrupted your earlier virtues. So you have to recover yourself. So the recovery of the self, but how do you recover yourself? Not by meditation, but what Gandhi would call satyagraha, which means as seeker of truth, you must non-cooperate. But you must non-cooperate non-violently. You must not practice violence, because violence is the mode through which the alien races have conquered us. So if you practice the same mode, if you inculcate the same mode, then you will have the same kind of vices that the alien rulers have. But if you want to purify yourself, then of course the way is that you seek truth, and seek truth individually. That is where Gandhi, as I said, straddles both the worlds. The world of individual self-inquiry and the world of nation-making. There Gandhi, of course, is very clear that it doesn't matter whether the country is with you or not. It's no bit ironical because Gandhi's whole actions, in a way, awakened the country. But Gandhi's argument was that when you were going out and when you were declaring non-cooperation with the British, you were doing it taking risk upon yourself. You must know the risk and you must go ahead. You must not look back and see whether others are coming. You have to redeem yourself. Yourself is compromised. So that is the reason why I'm saying Gandhi in a way straddles both the worlds. But otherwise, even in Gandhi's whole arguments, in fact, it's ironical because Gandhi, who placed so much emphasis on individual seeking truth, which is satyagrahi, the effect on the country was completely different. It was collective. Right? And it was not only collective, as some of the early subaltern studies writings show, that people at times took it also as an incitement to violence. If Gandhi has said that we must not cooperate with the British, there is a famous writing by Shahid Amin, which shows that as soon as Gandhi's message reaches the remotest of the villages in northern part of Bihar, a state of India, the villagers take it as a call to violence and they set fire to the British police stations, etc., etc. And Gandhi had to call off the movement, saying this is not what I wanted. So Gandhi wanted individual redemption, but its impact on the nation was precisely the opposite, something that I have tried to indicate. Now, through these discussions, I think we can summarize the following things. One is that the political subject in the anti-colonial and in the post-colonial thinking is more of a collective notion than linking to an individual self and inquiries of self. Second, the emergence of the political subject is a process that deals not so much with the identity of the subject, but much more with the identity of actions. So the politics is more about a discourse of actions rather than a chronicle of thinking. Three, in this kind of configuration of the political subject, you have, and this is my last point, that you have what you may say, using a bit of Gramscian terminology, a kind of a historical block of, on one hand, what Lenin would have termed as vanguard, and what you might call the general people, the followers, the rank and file, etc. In other words, the political subject does not mean that there is a leadership that is emerging. The leader who is now ready to carry forward, the people. But it indicates a situation which is extremely contentious, which is extremely conflictive, but it indicates a situation where there is a vanguard. The terrorist revolutionaries thought that if they could kill a British administrator, then the rest of the people will be enthused and will join them. There was certainly vanguardism in the thinking of the nationalist revolutionaries. Those who joined the mutiny or those who mutinied against the British and marched on to Delhi again thought that if they could capture Delhi, which was the seat of the old independent Mughal empire, then the rest of the country would rise up in revolt. So there is a kind of avant-garde thinking into the emergence of the subject. But with the crucial, proviso that it indicates a situation where, as I said, there is a historical block between the rest of the country who are not ready to be vanguard, who are not taking avant-garde actions, who are followers, but at the same time a kind of a unity is forged between the vanguard and the masses or the rank and file. And it is this situation, it's a transitory situation. It doesn't remain permanent. So even in Indian movement, Indian independence, we have seen the rise and ebb of the political consciousness of the people. And I will conclude this section with the part that even in the mid-60s and 70s, when again revolutionary activism gripped the country, today also you find the same thing in certain parts of the country. You can see these features of the colonial time re-emerging and demonstrating their salience. Now this will be, the part that I wanted to say about what I think to be the salient features of the post-colonial, political subjectivity. And now, if you like, then I can go into for maybe 10-15 minutes into the salience of these observations in terms of, as I said, I do not want to impose on you discussions on Marxism, but certain parts of it, why they are so crucial in terms of general left-wing thinking. Should I go into that? I seek your opinion on this. You see, towards the end, I kind of hinted that in the Marxist theory, there is a great amount of dispute on vanguardism. So Lenin has been accused of, practicing vanguardism, preaching a theory of vanguardism. If you read his What Is to Be Done, Lenin in fact says that a dozen wise men always better than 100 fools. He was very clear on that. And so quality and a band of dedicated. Now, but Lenin of course did not say only this much, but I do not want to go into that. But the crucial question would be that why is it necessary that we draw on the lessons of the colonial or the anti-colonial and the post-colonial, histories of the subjectivities into our current global thinking? Now, there are I will, talk very briefly of 2-3 reasons and then I shall end. One is, of course, that if you see the post-colonial time is configured by, let us say, 3-4 identities. There are many, but one is, of course, the footloose character of the post-colonial labor. Now, as you know that the production is mostly organized along informal lines in the post-colonial countries. There are features where you find a man seeking job from one to another, so between the plow and the pick, so between the peasant and the coal miner, there is a range of intermediary forms of labor and people are hopping from one job to another. In other words, migrant labor is a remarkable feature of the post-colonial labor process. You also find there is a great amount of transformation in the post-colonial countries in terms of logistics, in terms of digital infrastructure, in terms of material infrastructure, in terms of knowledge infrastructure. Whether you speak of the One Belt, One Road proposed by China, or you speak of the construction of the big ports, the container traffic, or think of the construction of the highways, the dams. There's a massive amount of infrastructure building which calls for millions and millions of people to be drafted into the army of construction labor, without which nothing can happen. Now, this footloose character of the labor, which is so much different from what had happened in the standard history of capitalism, is something that marks the subjectivity. And some of us have theorized it in terms of transit labor. What is it? What is it in the subjectivity of labor? What is it in the shaping of labor consciousness that this footloose character of labor, makes its point? There is the other question, which is that what does law play in it? Now, clearly, if you look into the annals of citizenship, which so much dominates the Western theories of the political subject, the citizen is the main concern here. The citizen is created, in a sense, by the Constitution, even though the citizen also creates the Constitution. But this whole idea of popular sovereignty, the idea of popular constitution making, the idea and the heritage of republicanism, and what has been called the Republican moment, the Machiavellian moment in Western history. Now, the history of the political subject in the East, if you allow me to put it in that way as shorthand, it's completely different. Or different to a radical extent, precisely for the attitude towards law. Because even though you have in Western history the idea of a Machiavellian moment, the idea of republicanism, but please understand, this republicanism is buttressed, underlined, guaranteed by constitution making, guaranteed by law, which has a strong tradition of positive law. Again, this is a sphere into which if we go, we need hours and hours of discussion, how law is crucial in making of this subject in the standard history of capitalism. On the other hand, in the post-colonial world, it is illegality and semi-legality that has been crucial. Because even though, and it is interesting that in the entire history of the emergence of the political subject in the anti-colonial time, and even today, people are hardly bothered about what is the constitution that we shall make. I'm not saying that constitution came as a result of high brains or high schemes from the top. The constitution that was framed as an independent India's constitution is revered, respected, valued. But this was not the great question. It came and people said, yes, we need it, and they did it. But here, the crucial question even today is, who are you to make the law? You may be the chief minister, you may be the president, you may be the judge, but it hurts us. We don't agree to what the law says. There is a basic attitude to legality. I wouldn't say from a standpoint of illegality. It is only from the point of law that you define what is outside law. But this, what has been called the popular domain of politics, the popular domain of politics is extremely important as the legal republican domain of politics. And the political subject emerges from that popular domain, from that domain which is semi-legal and which is illegal. Think of illegal squatter colonies in the cities of India. Think of the footloose labor who doesn't call for a labor permit to move from one labor site to another. Think of people who are clamoring for their rights, hardly caring for whether the laws have sanctioned them or not. And laws have not till been passed is one of the last excuse that the ruling class can give, even though it goes on giving these excuses. So if you think of the range of actions that people take on the streets, it is the street fighting mode in a shorthand sense I am using that word. It is this mode of fighting on the street. So it is therefore that illegal attitude, it is the semi-legal attitude that defines what politics will be, as against the legally defined domain of politics. Now, this is, to my mind, an extremely important question which has not been dealt even by the left-wing theoreticians, etc., etc. And this is something that one has to draw from radical strands of anti-colonial and post-colonial politics. If you study Thai politics, for example, now we speak of Italy where in the post 50 years of after the Second World War, apparently there were 30 governments. Nobody bothers about that. But if you speak of Thailand, if you speak of India, the others, people always question, oh, the rule is so unstable. Think of South Africa or Nepal, where constitution making took so much of a time. But it's not that the country was unstable, because the constitution has its own place. But it's not bigger than our lives. Now, this attitude towards constitution making, this attitude towards law, that law will shape our life, it is this attitude against which the subject emerges as a collective entity. The final point is that, does it mean, and again this is something for the theorists have to think of, does it mean that the political subject is a kind of a homogeneous subject because I am invoking the sense of the collective? And again, it is something on which we haven't pondered very much, that how come that such a heterogeneous subject, a subject which is marked by heterogeneity, elements of caste, gender, language, religion, think of any marker of division, you will see that plays itself out in the formation of the subject. Yet, how come that this plurality or this heterogeneity finally manages itself to weave into something collective? We are actually witnessing that in India at the current time, that there is so much of Dalit uprising, there is so much of Dalit struggle. And it is taking place at a time when we have an extremely right-wing government in Delhi, which tries to incorporate and subsume the Dalit heritage also, and says that we are for the Dalits. And it is precisely at this time that we find that the student movement with upper caste background rallying around Dalit student activists, where intellectuals are failing, but the students and youth, they are coming forward in an unprecedented way in taking up the Dalit cause. So what causes, I do not want to go into the details, but I want to pose the question which has not been adequately addressed. What causes the heterogeneity to finally congeal into what you can call a collective? And therefore, when we speak of political subject, therefore that's the deeper point that needs to be raised. When we speak of political subject, we are indicating a kind of generality. We may not admit it, but it's at the back of our mind that the displacement of the subject from an individualist orientation to a collective orientation, whether it is nationalist or Dalit or whatever it is, we are actually moving from something that we were thinking of in a fragmentary fashion to something which we are thinking in a much more collectivist mode. Now, in this displacement of subjectivity, which removes the individuality from it, the crucial question is, how does the general arise? What is it that causes generality? In a way, therefore, it's also the old Rousseauian question, what is it that causes something general? If it is not going to be a pure arithmetic collection of the individual, what is it that will cause something general to arise? Is it a pure act of abstraction? If it is so, but if it is at the same time this abstraction is a material process and it's not merely a thought process, but a process that actually occurs in society, happens in society, then what causes this displacement of the fragment and then moves on to a much more general level? Because clearly the anti-colonial history shows that the vanguard, I go back to those old, as I said, very infamous debates within the Marxists, that the vanguards, they thought they would go, they would move forward alone by themselves, etc., etc. But how come that the section which thinks itself to be the vanguard assumes on itself the responsibility to lead? If it doesn't want to lead the society, of course, it has no business of being a vanguard. But if it thinks that it has the responsibility of leading the society, a society which is still passive, then The next question is, instead of, pettifogging about the term vanguard or not, is how come that this vanguard espouses a general cause? What is it that makes its mission to be general and not, keeping itself confined to some particular existences? So what is it that leads heterogeneity to move on to much more generality? I think I'll stop here.